Welcome to Let's Talk Micro. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Let's Talk Micro. Now, this is not a new episode, but it's a re release from a previous episode, and I'll talk about that in a minute. As always, you can find Let's Talk Micro on all podcast platforms and on social media. I am on Instagram as Let's Talk Micro, no apostrophe, on Twitter as Let's Talk Micro 1, and on LinkedIn as Luis Plaza. So go ahead and follow, subscribe to the podcast, leave any feedback, any comments, any possible topic suggestions on social media. They are always welcome and appreciated. So I really want to thank you for your support and for listening to the podcast. It's some great information. I enjoy putting this information out there and sharing it with you. So following the last episode, which was about Wohlfarhtiimonas, chitiniclastica, great episode with David Gaston and Yember Ahmad, and they went over that particular case of Wohlfarhtiimonas. We talked about it. We talked about biochemical susceptibilities. So I thought it would be a good idea since Let's Talk Micro has new listeners to bring a previous episode about Wohlfarhtiimonas chitiniclastica and to just release it right after the latest episode. That way you can compare both of them. If you haven't listened to that one, the other one, you can go ahead and do so. So this episode that I'm releasing, it was originally published on February 24th of this year, and it was about an article titled Wohlfarhtiimonas chitiniclastica, Monomicrobial bacteremia in a homeless man. This episode featured Dr. Paul Luethy, who's an associate director of clinical microbiology laboratory at the University of Maryland Medical Center Laboratories of Pathology. So if you haven't checked it out, go ahead and do so and compare both episodes. The episode with Dr. Luethy was about a monomicrobial bacteremia, which from what I have learned and what we have seen, typically Wohlfarhtiimonas chitiniclastica is seen in polymicrobial infections, but in that previous case, it was seen in it was a monomicrobial bacteremia. So it's very interesting to compare and contrast. One thing that's a steady is that it is transmitted by a fly, and we see it typically in a population of the homeless. So that previous case, it was identified originally on a Vitek MS Malditov platform. On the last episode with David Gaston and Yember Ahmad, it was identified via the Bruker. But both episodes, they go over biochemicals, they go over morphology, they go over susceptibilities. So I just invite you to go ahead and check it out if you haven't already. And definitely, if you haven't listened to the last episode with Dr. Gaston and Dr. Ahmad, go ahead and do so. It was a great episode. I had a great time recording it, and it was great. Dr. Gaston, he provided so much more information about how blood cultures work, and we talked about biochemicals and so much more. So let's go ahead and listen to this episode. And like I said, it was originally published on February 24th of this year, episode 35. So on today's episode, we are here to discuss an article. Nowadays with instruments and such as the Malditov, we're seeing more organisms, more that we have, there sometimes, we haven't heard of them. So on today's episode, we are going to discuss an article titled Wohlfarhtiimonas chitiniclastica, Monomicrobial bacteremia in a homeless man. This was published in the Emergent Infectious Diseases Journal from the CDC on December of 2021. So to discuss this article today, I have Dr. Paul Luethy, which he's an assistant professor at the University of Maryland School of Medicine, and also an associate director of the Clinical Microbiology Laboratory at the University of Maryland Medical Center Laboratories of Pathology. So Dr. Luethy, welcome to Let's Talk Micro.
Hey, thanks, Louis. Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to talk about this really weird organism.
It's definitely an unusual case. So can we start? Let's start with a summary about the article.
Yeah, sure. So this is a guy who came in the summer of 2020. He's a little bit older. He's in his 60s, and unfortunately, he was homeless. And he came in, he had some vascular issues. So he had deep vein thrombosis, chronic venous insufficiency. And he was found in a single parking spot in Maryland for 3 days. So kind of bad situation, not great. When he came in, he was admitted, he had a septic shock, and his blood cultures upon coming in for septic shock, he grew these interesting gram-negative rods. And they really couldn't be identified by any of the methods we had in the laboratory. And so they grew in the anaerobic blood culture bottle, and they had to be identified, as you mentioned at the beginning, by Molotov MS is giving us all these ideas, new IDs. And so by Molotov in our laboratory, we identified this as the Wohlfarhtiimonas chitiniclastica. And we confirmed that by 16S sequencing. And this was a pretty cool case because often, as the infectious diseases fellow found in his literature search, this organism is usually not found by itself. Usually it's found in a polymicrobial infection. And this was only the second case of a monomicrobial single organism blood culture caused by, or blood infection sepsis caused by this organism.
Okay, so at other times it is found along with other organisms in blood cultures.
Yeah, in blood and as well as wound cultures as well. So there's in this paper there's a big table, and it talks about how it's the, let me see, what did it have? There's one that had like P. acnes and a coag-negative staph along with it. One that had Proteus along with it. Another one that had other enterics like a Providencia and a Proteus, as well as a Staphylococcus aureus. So you're seeing multiple microorganisms. And usually, right, when you see that, you say, okay, well, it's the gram-negative rods, like the Providencia and the Proteus, and then maybe it's the Staphylococcus aureus that are causing the real infection here. So this was interesting because the man came in with just a single bug, this single Wohlfarhtiimonas, and that was determined to be the cause of his septic shock.
Okay, so and then this is for the audience, is like Dr. Luethy says. So this is a gram-negative rod, and so as far as so you mentioned, so the patient here, he was homeless. So what kind of patient population do we normally see this organism on?
So this organism, there's been quite a few looks of what type of people, and unfortunately, it seems to be one associated with lower economic class. So homeless individuals, those who may not be as well off. Poor hygiene is something that is associated, and so that might be associated with those of a lower socioeconomic class, as well as those who maybe live closer to livestock, as well as have issues such as alcoholism. And this guy was older, so he was in his 60s. So again, also people who are a little bit older as well. And the reason why this is all associated with people who are, homeless or lower socioeconomic status or poor hygiene is because this organism is found largely due to people who are also, I guess, infected, or I guess maybe you want to say colonized with fly larvae. So this bacteria is associated with fly larvae and is found inside of the fly larvae.
Well, that's definitely very interesting. So you mentioned, so none of the instruments other than Molotov could identify it. So, there are several products out there from Molotov. Which one was it identified on?
So we have in our laboratory, we have the Vitek mass spectrometer. So that worked very well. It gave a very good idea. It's not one that is currently claimed, at least at this time, on the FDA database. Who knows, in a couple months from now, someone might come back and listen to this and it might be claimed later on. But at this moment in time, it's not claimed on the database. So that's why we had to pursue additional identification via 16S sequencing. I do believe that the Bruker Molotov can also identify it as well.
Okay, all right. So Vitek, the MS, that's the same one that I'm familiar with, that I use. So, but this is just the regular. It's not the RUO. It's just regular Vitek MS.
Right. Yeah, just the regular, and sometimes, right, as you've probably seen, that organisms that are kind of weird aren't as common. The database is actually probably right, and probably in this case it can identify some of those weird organisms as the company is adding more and more spectra to the database. And so that's what this case was here, but again, just not one that has been submitted for FDA approval yet. So it's kind of one of those use at your own risks, and that's why we submitted it for sequencing for confirmation.
Yes, and for the audience out there, I mean, those of you that work with bacteremia, so organisms that are not claimed, they show with an N on the ID, and definitely you do have a range from the unusual, and even sometimes some that we do see commonly in the lab, such as like Erycoccus urinae. So typically, the lab will proceed to validate them via other methods, and then after you get an X number of samples, then even though the N is never going to go away, it's always on your database is going to show up like that. But if your laboratory has validated it, then you can go ahead and accept it, which is the case like with, we have done with Erycoccus urinae and other organisms.
Yeah, we've done the same thing. And we would have loved to have been able to do this with biochemical testing on this one. But, I was looking in some of the textbooks, and it really isn't positive for many things. It's really just some weekly acidification of some of the sugars, and that's about it, besides catalase and oxidase. So it's one of your environmental non-fermenters that doesn't give you a good answer on your biochemical test strips.
Okay, and definitely also, since it's such an unusual organism, you're not going to have enough samples to validate it on your database. So you will have to proceed with another method of identifying it, just like as you did. So you mentioned, so not much as far as biochemicals. So do you know, for us here in the lab, which media does it grow on?
Yeah, so it actually grows pretty well on all the standard media. So we grew it on blood, chocolate, and McConkey. And on McConkey agar, it's a non-fermenter, so it would not turn purple, right? As a non-lactose fermenter, because it's a non-fermenter in general, not just not a lactose fermenter. And the colonies, they're described as being short coccoid rods, that when they grow, the colonies are flat, slightly spready colonies. Again, they're oxidase positive, non-fermenters, they're indole negative. So that's something that you could see as well. And then again, yeah, it's like pretty much almost everything else negative as well.
Okay, so definitely, so in the case that if we encounter it in the lab, then you will be able to see it by the standard media. So it will grow along with McConkey definitely, and blood, like you said, chocolate. Okay. So for us here, as far as, like us medical lab scientists, in the lab, we're working this, we get this organism. So what do we do as far as susceptibilities?
That's a great question. There aren't any breakpoints for this organism, right? It's so weird because it's associated with fly larvae. You have to have fly larvae eating you somewhere to even get this, that there are no CLSI, there are no FDA, there are no UCAS breakpoints. That doesn't mean that people haven't tried to use susceptibility testing to try to interpret how to treat. There are reports of people using e-tests. There was a paper I was reading that they were using the microscan type of panels. So your automated panels like a microscan or a Vitek or other companies' automated panels that they've placed on there. And when they've tried to interpret, they've used most often the non-Enterobacteriaceae CLSI or UCAS breakpoints. And so they've used those to interpret. Of note, some of the textbooks say in their tiny little entry of like a paragraph and a half about this organism that it's resistant to penicillin, but that it's pretty susceptible to some of the other antibiotics. That includes the other beta-lactams like the cephalosporins, as well as some of the other things like the fluoroquinolones, so your levofloxacin, your ciprofloxacin. It seemed to be pretty sensitive to that as well. And that's ultimately what our team at our hospital treated with. They first started with a cephalosporin, ceftriaxone, and then they moved the patient to levofloxacin upon discharge.
Okay, so there are no breakpoints, but was there any like testing set up in the lab, or was it more like, the patient was put on something and then he responded to the treatment?
Yeah, it was that they put him on the ceftriaxone first and he responded really well. They went straight to the literature since we didn't really know what to do with this thing. And due to their homeless status and poor socioeconomic status, they wanted to get out of the hospital as soon as possible. And so they were just looking for whatever guidance they could find in the literature to determine how to treat this guy.
Okay. And then you said so, and sometimes they might use like on the CLSI, the non-fermenting gram-negative rods.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, it could be used for that, right? It's one of those ones that no one's really sure what the best thing to use is for that one. Besides that, you just can't use it for Pseudomonas aeruginosa, Burkholderia patient, ones that already have other breakpoints. So it's kind of that weird catch-all one that kind of does catch-all, kind of doesn't. It's kind of weird.
Okay, definitely. So as far as, so when like we get this organism and then in the lab and then we call, we notify the physician and say, hey, the patient has Wohlfarhtiimonas. Was it chitiniclastica?
I think chitiniclastica, yeah.
Chitiniclastica. So as far as from an infection prevention standpoint, are there any measures? I mean, not much is known about this organism.
Yeah, I don't think there are. I mean, especially by itself, I don't think there's anything that you worry about, like contact precautions or anything like that. It's associated with the larvae. So if the people don't have the larvae on them, you don't have to really worry about that being spread through that way. I think most likely what the infection prevention standards would be is, again, there's only 2 cases of it with by itself causing an infection. It's almost always with something else. And so you'd probably be following contact precautions, for example, for your MRSA or VRE or something else that might also be causing infection at the same time in the same wound or the same blood culture, that you isolate this from, rather than just from the Wohlfarhtiimonas on its own.
Okay. And as far as from the article, so the patient recovered, was put on treatment, and he responded?
Yeah, very quickly he responded and to the ceftriaxone.
Okay, that's good. So this is definitely, and for the audience out there, that's what, it's always good to, correlate the history with the organism that you have. And that's something that all of us technologists and, we should definitely always pay attention to when we see organisms, especially unusual ones. Do the research, search in textbooks, and of course, always, pull the patient's history and see. And this, it seems that it's, homeless, seen in a homeless population, and it's caused by larvae. So this is definitely a very unusual case. But for those of you out there that are, nowadays, that if you have moldy stuff in your lab, it's always good to keep it in the back of your mind if you ever see this. That way, now, with this information out there, that in which direction to go forward. Anything else about this case, Dr. Luethy, that you want to tell the audience?
Not that I can think of. Definitely just a weird bug. I mean, I think the story behind it's kind of fun. Interesting fact I was reading is it has this really, as the name suggests, it has a really strong chitin-ase ability, so it can chew up chitin. And they think that because it's associated with the larvae, that it is a symbiote with the larvae, meaning that they mutually benefit each other, and that it might be involved with the chitinase activity in metamorphosis of the larvae to a fly, from the worm larvae stage to the fly stage, because as it's metamorphosizing, it chews up the chitin in the larvae and helps it change into a fly. And I just thought that was kind of crazy and weird, that something could help out with that.
Wow, it definitely is. All right. Well, Dr. Luethy, I want to thank you for taking the time to come in over to Let's Talk Micro and talk about this case.
Yeah, it was a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
All right. You're welcome. And that, my dear audience, it's the end of this episode. If you hadn't listened to this episode before about Wohlfarhtiimonas chitiniclastica, I hope you enjoyed it. As always, I am so happy to share all this information with you. Continue bringing that passion to what you do. It's so important. And stay tuned to Let's Talk Micro. Continue subscribing, leaving any feedback. A lot of good stuff is coming your way. So thank you for listening, and please continue doing so. As always, stay motivated, stay safe, and of course, continue talking micro. Until the next time. Bye.